Welcome to Space Matters, the Space Governance Podcast, where the Australasian Centre for Space Governance invites experts from across the Asia-Pacific region and around the world to discuss with us the most pressing issues of space governance, policy, and law. We acknowledge that many members of the ACSG live and work on Indigenous country. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and to all First Nations as knowledge holders of responsible governance of lands, waters, and skies. Hi, I'm Dr. Cassandra Steer. I am the CEO of the Australasian Centre for Space Governance and your host today on the Space Matters podcast. I'm really excited to welcome you to season 3 of our podcast, which has a bit of a new look and feel to it. If you've been listening to our previous 2 seasons, you might notice some different energy, different tweak, and that's in large part due to the fact that we have a new producer on board with us, Daniel McKay. Our first 2 seasons were produced by Amelia of Meals Studio, and she was amazing, really fantastic work that she did in helping us to establish the podcast and set up a vision for who it is that we want to be speaking to and with in terms of you, our audience, as well as our guests, and the flavor of the first 2 seasons. Dan brings his own flavor, his own energy, and we're really excited to be working with him for season 3 in 2026 and hopefully beyond. You will also hear from Andre Kwok as a host in some of the episodes this season. And we are really leaning into the focus for the rest of this year on experts from across the Asia-Pacific region and how we can think about framing space cooperation amongst ourselves in the region, what kinds of needs there are, what kind of space activities there already are, what kind of legislation and regulation, what kind of policies are in place or might need to be in place to sustain and support even more cooperation across the region. This episode is really a framing episode, I guess, for the rest of the season. And what we decided to do was bring to you a keynote presentation that I gave at the beginning of a workshop hosted by the ACSG on the 17th of April. That workshop was titled Building Shared Satellite Connectivity in the Asian Century. So we had speakers and participants from the Australian Department of Defence, as well as the Malaysian Department of Defence, Geoscience Australia, CSIRO, which is the Commonwealth Science Organisation, the Australian Space Agency. We had academic experts from across a range of different universities, including most prominently the universities where members of the ACSG reside, but also some researchers from Fiji and Samoa. And we also had some distinguished speakers from the Philippines, India, and Japan. So it was an incredible gathering, a really interesting lineup of speakers for all of the sessions, a lot of time for discussion and question and digging into the issues more. So the keynote that I gave at the beginning of the day really helped to frame what is meant by the Asian century, this political science term to describe this new multipolar geopolitical era we are in, where Asian powers are really the focus and the crux of many issues. So I hope that you enjoy the keynote speech. I hope that it's useful as a framing piece. And I really look forward to engaging with you throughout the rest of this season. So we had quite a discussion about what to call the workshop today. And what I want to do now is really frame the case for regional space cooperation in the Asian century and talk about what do we mean by space cooperation? What do we mean by the Asian century? But let me start with shared needs. So some of you, this is your bread and butter. Some of you, perhaps it isn't. But I just want to make sure that we really are all on the same page. When we're thinking about shared needs and our dependencies on space-based capabilities, space infrastructure, space connectivity, space data. So for example, Earth observation supports, of course, the agricultural sector and therefore our food security. Farmers use Earth observation data to understand irrigation and crops so they can be not only more competitive, but also climate resistant, particularly if you're in arid climates. There was an example of an outage, actually I believe that was PNT and not Earth observation, but an outage for a few hours a couple of years ago of a satellite, which meant that farmers were unable to do their work. A lot of their equipment is now automated. And some farmers in the media said it was like being back in the 1990s. And some commentaries said, the 1990s aren't that long ago. Couldn't you have coped? But the problem is the infrastructure that they're using is very different from the 1990s. It's highly dependent on that satellite connectivity. And they also have fewer farmhands than they had in the 1990s because of that automation of equipment. Earth observation is extremely important for monitoring water quality. I'm going to say a little bit more about where Australia gets its data from, and we're hearing from Sandra Farrell from CSIRO later today, who'll be talking more about water quality monitoring. But that's in terms of our drinking water. It's in terms of also climate data more generally. Climate resilience is also highly dependent on Earth observation data. Being able to track over time the health of our planet over decades, thanks to programs like the US Landsat program. We have decades of data, and Australia is a key player in managing that data, but also in a more immediate sense, on a day-to-day sense, rather than over decades. And the ability to respond to climate disasters, natural disasters. So the Philippines hosted last year an annual regional conference that JAXA, the Japanese Space Agency, facilitates. And the week that they held it was 2 weeks after an earthquake, which itself was 2 weeks after a tsunami, which itself was 2 weeks after another earthquake. And the Philippines suffers multiple of these natural climate-related disasters every year. And they are therefore urgently aware of how important it is for them to have sovereign access to Earth observation data. Maritime domain awareness is obviously a key issue for the region, both from a literal defence lens, being able to monitor what potential adversaries are doing in our waters around the Pacific region, also in terms of fishing, protecting legal fishing and being able to prevent unlawful fishing. Some border and economic zone protections very much need Earth observation data. The mining and gas industries, highly dependent on Earth observation for prospecting, for tracking the opportunities, but also are there leaks? And of course, in our time of energy crisis, I think we can say, that kind of data is also highly critical. Methane emissions, another climate application. Carbon sinks as well. Can we track, without needing to do ground truthing, the actual density of vegetation and what kind of vegetation it is and whether it is providing the kind of carbon sink that we think it is? Queensland is a world leader in using Earth observation data to protect against unlawful water theft and deforestation. And that's used in the courtroom as evidence to provide clear evidence, and we sometimes need experts to translate that evidence for the judge, but having visual evidence to demonstrate that water theft. And then, of course, we have satellite communications. So this is about connecting remote and rural communities across a vast landscape like Australia, across countries like the Philippines, which are an archipelago of many, many islands, across very difficult terrains in some countries. It's about providing online education and therefore closing the digital divide for some communities where access to education is highly dependent on being able to do remote. And we all lived through that in COVID, remote and online education, but for some areas that is their only access to education. So satellite connectivity has to do with the Sustainable Development Goals, being able to ensure there's equity, accessibility to education and communications. And of course, we need communications in the face of natural disasters. We have a telecommunications expert who's going to be speaking later today. But the example of the eruption of a volcano very close to Tonga a couple of years ago and the complete loss of undersea cable access for their communications. But they already had a sovereign satellite dish which they use to access satellite data for their university, which has campuses across a number of islands. And that suddenly became a piece of critical infrastructure in the face of a natural disaster. So island nations understand this better than some bigger island nations like Australia. And of course, in the face of conflict as well, communications are absolutely critical, not only for military operations, but for civilians. And we've seen that in Iran with the government shutting down the internet, shutting down communications as a tactic not only as a kind of military and government tactic, but also to prevent journalists being able to get information in and out, prevent civilians from perhaps organising themselves. So that connectivity is absolutely critical in warfare, and we do have a whole panel where we're going to be looking at very much the security and defence lens. Position, navigation and timing, or PNT, your GPS obviously is one example of that. Highly critical for you to find your way here today and know where to come into this room. Even more critical for global shipping and global transport, civil aviation. All of that is extremely dependent on position, navigation and timing. Our payment systems, quite often if you're buying something with your phone or your watch, if you're using internet banking, but the entire global financial system, including any of you who have very nervous investments right now, very, very dependent on position, navigation and timing connectivity. Farming and mining equipment, I mentioned the example earlier of an outage of a satellite that impacted farmers. Mining equipment also highly automated and highly dependent on that PNT connectivity. And search and rescue, of course, being able to identify, again, in the face of natural disasters in particular, but search and rescue of individuals as well. So in all of that, those are our kind of traditional three buckets of what satellites do. Obviously, things are getting more complicated today as satellites do more than one of those things or start to do other things like data centers and so on, which we're going to see more of. But our three traditional categories are really what we're going to be focusing on today. And I did mention some defense and security applications in that list, but today's militaries cannot operate without satellite connectivity. They are deaf, dumb and blind without satellite connectivity. So it is highly critical for our national and regional security to have continued and assured access to that connectivity, which is a problem if you are a country that depends 100% on others to provide that connectivity. Earth observation satellites provide more than half of the world's climate data. And if we think about Pacific Island nations in particular, they're amongst the most vulnerable in the world when it comes to climate change, rising sea levels, but also the knock-on effects of that with tsunamis and earthquakes and extreme weather events. It is an existential crisis for some Pacific Island nations. The average economic loss due to climate-induced disasters is about 5% of GDP. And remember the number of natural disasters that I mentioned as one example for the Philippines within the space of about 6 weeks. Some of that climate data, as I've learned from people like Paul Tregoning, who's here, can only come from space. We can't actually get some of that data from anywhere but satellites. We also have 90% of our weather data coming from satellites. And that's not just what do I wear today, that is also can planes take off? What do we do about shipping? And again, you know, how do we predict and mitigate bushfires and other natural disasters? In Australia, we are 100% dependent on others, foreign partners and or commercial partners, some of which are foreign commercial, to provide this data and this connectivity, either access to the infrastructure or actual just provision of the data. When it comes to Earth observation, our key providers are Japan, the US and Europe through different programs, each of which provide very, very different data products because they have different satellite systems and also they have been designed for their specific regional geography and needs. So for example, the Landsat Earth observation system, which has been around for over 50 years, but mostly built, and there will be some experts in the room who might correct what I'm about to say, but mostly built with North American geography in mind. So vast, wide, deep bodies of water, big lakes and lots of them, which is not what we have in Australia, and it's not what a lot of other countries in the region have. We have smaller rivers and estuaries, we have more shallow bodies of water. So we have different needs, we are still dependent on that, but we use these very, very different data products, and we've had to figure out how to interpret all of that data, how to make use of different data products, overlay them and turn them into useful products for Australia and also for our partners in the region. The other thing I think with Landsat, and again, I may be wrong, but my understanding is that that's great at identifying and mitigating when there are bushfires, for example. You'll see a lot of images on the internet of when we've had these, black summers of bushfires in Australia. A lot of that imagery comes from US Landsat program. But that's not so great at predicting where the bushfires might take place, how fast they might spread, because again, we have very different vegetation in Australia and in the region. A lot of eucalypt, it burns differently, it dries up in different ways and therefore burns in different ways. And so the sensors that Landsat has is not properly calibrated to the kind of information we need to predict and prevent bushfires. So there's some research happening here at the ANU to develop something called OzFuel, which is sensors that are, and it's OzFuel because it's about the fuel load of eucalypt and similar vegetation. When it dries up, it has a fuel load of being able to burn a lot, as we know. So being able to have sensors that are properly calibrated to the kind of information that we here in the region need. When we think again of satellite communications, because that was more about Earth observation again, we have a connectivity challenge here in the region because of geography. We have remote communities, and I'm not just talking about Australia, I'm talking about countries in the region. A lot of places with very remote communities, rural communities, a lot of places that are, as I said, like the Philippines, an archipelago of many islands. Vast geography, if we think of India and Australia, mountainous terrain, often quite difficult to keep people connected. And as I said, we're going to hear from Amanda Watson later today, who will be talking through us through some of the challenges of undersea cables versus satellite connectivity. It's also therefore very important to think about sovereign connectivity, sovereign access to that satellite communication need for internet and for literal telecommunications. We don't necessarily want to be relying on Mr. Elon Musk. So Starlink is amazing for people who live in rural or remote areas. It's been a game changer for them. But if you track any of this, you will have seen that in Ukraine, Starlink was offered for free at one stage and then it was turned off at one stage because Elon Musk didn't like how it was being utilised. So it became very politicised, and we all have tracked a little bit of what Elon Musk has been up to in the last couple of years. A highly politicised figure who has an enormous amount of political and technological power, being able to make decisions about switching that connectivity on and off during a conflict. The point being, it's not just armed services using that, it's civilians during a conflict who then lost connectivity when it was switched off. There's also been highly politicised conversations about whether or not he would provide connectivity in Gaza, and if so, for whom? Who gets access to that? And similarly, when Iran has been switching the internet access off, Starlink has sometimes talked about going in or not going in. So Pacific Island nations are tracking this and are very concerned about their dependency on a commercial provider. If there are going to be new political tensions, politicised interactions, if some of these countries do have technological dependencies on China, some of them have technological dependencies on the US. And so having to choose between those offerings when things are becoming more and more tense in the region is very uncomfortable. We've seen countries like Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu, Tonga and Niue actually ban access to or refuse to license access to Starlink. And Samoa had first banned it and then allowed it. So it is a highly political decision to think about satellite connectivity, but also to think about not every country has the economy to be able to build all of that itself. So smaller economies can't do it all. It used to be that it was only the big powers who could afford to access space that had the technological and economic wherewithal to even access space. And therefore, they built end-to-end accessibility. The manufacture of the satellite, the design of whatever the onboard technology is, whether it's SATCOM or Earth observation, the rocket and the launch vehicle to get it to space, the launch pad and all of the infrastructure around that, then the operations of the satellite in space, the need to avoid colliding with other satellites, the ability to have the ground infrastructure to receive the data, the ability to downlink the data, the ability to manage that data and then utilise it for national needs. That is an end-to-end capability that takes decades to build, an enormous amount of money and the skill set that needs to be built up to do that kind of thing. Today, we don't need to have end-to-end capability. And of course, there's a lot of commercial partners in there. Of the, I think we're up to 17,000 operational satellites now. The numbers are literally changing every month. Of those, 75% are commercially owned. And so countries can contract with companies to build a satellite for them. They can also just say, we'll just buy the data, so space as a service. That is very much part of the landscape or the spacescape these days. But while commercial providers can provide some of the infrastructure and some of the data, some of it needs to be sovereign, whether that is the ground infrastructure, whether that is data sovereignty, because if we're buying it from a commercial provider, we do not own that data, whether it's the space segment. And then let me say something about that, because that is not evident to everybody. When we say space connectivity or satellites or space infrastructure, it's not just what's in space. There's the space segment, the satellite, the space object. There's the ground segment, so you need a satellite dish or something to receive that information. This is part of the ground segment that you're all carrying in your pocket, but obviously more complex ground infrastructure. There is the link segment. Every satellite needs to send its information somehow down to Earth. And then there is the human segment. So you and I are users, the government is a user, but there's also the operators, the scientists designing these kind of things, the civilian dependencies, as well as the technical and operational side of things. So the 4 segments. And we can think about sovereignty over one or some of those segments rather than needing to have sovereignty over all of those segments. Australia, as Tristan just told us, has consistently decided not to invest in the end-to-end approach. It's consistently said things like there are more important things than space research, and we need to think carefully about our limited resources. But meanwhile, there are other countries in the region with similar economies or sometimes smaller economies which have said, we can't afford to do the entire thing, but we must do some parts of it, and we must do so very consciously because of these dependencies. If we think of South Korea and India and Japan, who have satellite manufacture, for example, some countries have managed to build smaller satellites: Singapore, Indonesia, the Philippines, Thailand. Japan is a bit different. Japan has end-to-end capability. It is an absolute leader in the region. It is a leader in the world when it comes to space. So I sometimes describe space as a space middle power. I think perhaps we should talk about it as a space major power. It has end-to-end capability. It has satellite manufacture. It has launch. It is a key launch provider in the region, both for satellites. It also has capability in human spaceflight in the sense that it has astronauts. It has heritage in that. It has heritage in space stations as well. It contributes to the International Space Station. Satellite operations, data management, ground stations, space science, even space returns. They have been very much leaders in that. And of course, Australia has partnered with them in bringing back the Hayabusa mission, which took extracts and samples from an asteroid. We're going to hear more about Japan later today. But my point is that this is a space major power. It is a regional middle power. Japan has absolutely clear for itself what role these space capabilities play in its identity as a nation and its ambitions as a nation and what it's doing in the region. Japan is also supporting the region through the Asia-Pacific Regional Space Agency Forum, or APRSAF. So I mentioned that earlier. It facilitates this every year, and a different country hosts it each year. It's quite interesting speaking to people from the Japanese Space Agency, JAXA, and then also from their Ministry of Foreign Affairs, because I've described APRSAF as a soft power tool, as a policy tool. And the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, people kind of, well, you could say that, right? But I think JAXA is very clear that not a soft power necessarily. It's not about asserting a forceful presence. It is very much about building those trusted relationships around these critical capabilities and uplifting countries in the region, because Japan knows that it too benefits from other countries in the region being uplifted in that sense. So we don't need to emulate Japan. No country in the region needs to try and be another Japan. The point is we need to partner more with them on these space capabilities and on the way in which they engage around space cooperation as a policy relationship building. Hence the term burden sharing in one of our panels today, and I'm very glad that Art Cotterell is going to be moderating that, because burden sharing, of course, means particular things depending who is using that language. So I want to say something a little bit more about the Asian century and what we mean by that. So in 2012, and I was reminded by Gerard Oakes about this when I was speaking with him the other day. In 2012, we had a white paper under the Julia Gillard government that was called Australia in the Asian Century. And there was a roadmap to prepare Australia for a tectonic shift in global power that was already very evident in 2012. It was about the rise of Asia. It was very explicit that this is not just about the rise of China. And it wasn't about putting China in a threat lens. It was very much an economic approach. At the transformation of the global economy as becoming more Asia-focused, Asia-central, Asia-driven. In that 2012 strategic vision, it was stated that by 2025, Asia would be the largest producer of goods and services and the largest consumer of them, and that therefore Australia would need to become more Asia literate, would need to deepen its economic, political and cultural integration in the region. We were, and perhaps still are, kind of the big white elephant in the room in the region, a Western country in the Asian region trying to grapple with that identity. There were 5 pillars under that white paper, 5 kind of lines of effort. One of them had to do with productivity and economic reform to make sure that the economic and trade between our partner nations could be facilitated. A capabilities and education and skills pillar. And that really leaned on the need for including more languages in our schools and our education system, highlighting Mandarin, Hindi, Indonesian and Japanese. When I went to high school here in Canberra, I could choose between French and German. The third pillar was business links, so helping Australian businesses to navigate Asian markets, but also ensuring that any kind of policy or regulatory barriers we might have in Australia for Asian companies to do more work in Australia would be lowered. The fourth was regional security and diplomacy, so deepening ties with Asian nations while maintaining a critical security alliance with the US. So already starting to try and tread that line carefully. And the fifth was deeper ties people to people, so cultural exchanges, tourism, a diplomatic presence. So how do we score 15 years later on that? Well, 1 year after that one paper, government shifted and we had the Tony Abbott-led coalition. So the entire vision shifted very quickly. A lot of that got shelved, in particular, the language offerings at schools. We didn't see a huge rise in Hindi and Mandarin and Japanese and Indonesian being offered, and that is a huge loss for Australia. We are much more multicultural than we were in 2012. By definition, as a nation, we are therefore multilingual, and yet we don't identify that way, and we don't have enough Caucasian Australians speaking those languages. We've obviously seen a massive geopolitical shift since 2012. I think that we could already have said that 5 years ago, but that is very evident for us today. A complicated relationship with China because we have deepened our trade ties with them and our economic relationship, and that in fact is a stability piece, but it also makes things a little bit complicated. And obviously a highly complicated relationship with the United States right now. We have become more multicultural, but we don't necessarily think of ourselves that way. So maybe rather than a white paper saying Australia in the Asian century, maybe what we'd be thinking more in 2026 is partnerships in the Asian century. Less of a trying to locate Australia in the region and more of thinking about the existing partnerships mutually and how to grow them. The term Asian century, of course, we've had previous Asian centuries. We've had Mesopotamian, Chinese dynasties, Indian empires, Mongolian, Byzantine eras. So we are just entering another Asian century. It's a political science term that's been kicked around very much since the 1980s. Often it's credited to Deng Xiaoping when he was the Chinese leader in 1988. During a visit to the then Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, he said, we may be entering a century of Asia and the Pacific. Although I think he then said, I don't agree that that is the case. But we've seen similar terms earlier in political science. Already back in 1924, Karl Haushofer used the term the Pacific Age. He predicted where we see the rise of Japan, China, and India. So back in the early 20th century, of course, which was the end of the 19th century British Empire and the beginning of what was to become Pax Americana, or the American century. He already was predicting the rise of a Pacific Age that would either preempt or follow that. Pax Americana, or the American century, is now over. I reside and do a lot of work in Canada as well as in Australia, and Prime Minister Carney has obviously been very much in the headlines with his speech at Davos and work he's done previous and following on from that, where he talked about the shift in the global order, and he said, this is a rupture. This is not a transition. This has happened. We are not witnessing something slowly unfold. This is a rupture. And he talked about, and there is a lot of discussion about our precious international rules-based order crumbling as a result of that. I think the point that we can really make, though, is that has been crumbling for quite some time, and also that it has been cherry-picked, as Prime Minister Carney pointed out, an order created by Western powers post-Second World War to their own benefit and interest, and then cherry-picking around that. So sometimes international law has applied to the US, sometimes it hasn't. Sometimes it's applied to the UK or France, sometimes it hasn't. And the inability to call out those instances or to enforce those instances, the breaches of international law, doesn't mean that the order ceases to exist. It doesn't mean that international law ceases to exist. It just means we have a very weak enforcement system. It has been pretty weak already since the end of the Cold War. It is now further weakened. So what do we do about that? Well, the Asian powers are much older cultures than the US, than this unipolar power that we saw for the last half decade. They're used to playing a much longer game. That's very much the case for China, but it's the case for a lot of countries in the region. I think the Asian century is to be celebrated. I think there are enormous positive and exciting opportunities in this multipolar era where Asia-Pacific is the crux of that. And obviously that is not to underplay what's going on in the Middle East right now, huge shifts for Europe as well. But that European-US order that we saw emerge post-World War II, perhaps it's not such a bad thing for that chapter now to have come to an end, and for us to have already entered a new chapter and to consciously enter that chapter thinking a little bit more about what we want that order to look like collectively. So not dumping international rules, but a shift in the order that the rules were established to protect, and whose interests are now protected and who gets to participate in the forming of what comes next in this order. We have so many rich, diverse cultures across the Asia-Pacific with long histories, with very different relational approaches to the environment, to technology, to community, to international relations, and the will and ability to work together to create a strong region because there are so many smaller players as well as some middle players. Not having to choose between China or the US for the provision of certain technologies because those always come with strings attached. So the 2012 white paper also predicted what was going to happen economically in the region. And in 2026, China is the second largest economy, India is the third largest economy, and Indonesia perhaps already is the fourth largest, but will certainly become the fourth largest very soon. 60% of the world's population lives in Asia and the Asia-Pacific region. Nearly 40% of global GDP is in the Asia-Pacific region. The Asia-Pacific Economic Community, there's 21 countries, 21 economies that make up APEC, and it's home to 2.9 billion people in total. If we were to really lean into participating in generating that order that leverages the cultures, the people, the technology, the different approaches, and the multiple but actually quite shared values, then in fact, those countries working together can achieve so much more than greater powers competing on their own. And so this leads us to really what we're talking about today, which is the role that space technology collaboration can play as a policy lever in all of that. So because of our shared needs and dependencies on space-based data and space connectivity, the ability or the opportunity to build that infrastructure together, so rather than competing, rather than saying we need to do end-to-end, which bits can we contribute into shared infrastructure? As I mentioned, Australia is already outstanding at the ground infrastructure and data end of Earth observation. We have amazing technology in terms of the ground infrastructure for communications. if we were to share the cost burden, share the technology expertise, and build shared infrastructure, not only are we then providing for shared needs, but we're building trust. We're contributing to security. A byproduct of that is that we actually shore up the region in a security sense at a time when this is becoming more and more necessary. I'm kind of hesitant to compare to the EU, but because I don't want to say we should do what Europeans have done in the past. But there is something quite useful in thinking about the EU project. So post-World War II, trying to rebuild after the devastation across the continent, it started off with a coal and steel community, very rare and necessary resources. So they put in place rules about where it could come from, who could access it, and what it could be used for, rationing coal and steel across the community. From that, we saw the European Economic Community come into place, which was about building an internal market, building internal economic interdependencies, making sure that there was ability for skills and labour to cross borders, that for technology to be shared, and for an internal economic market to build up. On the understanding that having economic interdependency will lead to peace, because you won't be warring with those who you share that economic dependency on and who you have an internal market with. Around that, then you have generated governance and laws, and it gets highly complex and bureaucratic, but human rights laws, labour laws, environmental laws, and now we're seeing a lot of movement around EU space laws. Has, various kind of regulatory problems, but the point is working together with that interdependency and ensuring peace, at least across Western Europe. That has been a highly successful project, and I think we're seeing the EU or Europe as a region stepping back into its power, given everything that is going on right now geopolitically. So there's no need to replicate that, but that interdependency is a lesson learned, I think. So to hark back again to Prime Minister Carney, he really was talking about the role of middle powers today, and I know that he spoke to that when he came here and visited and spoke to Parliament. Bridging divides, all kind of rowing in a similar direction, because we can achieve so much more when middle powers work together that way. And he uses the term variable geometry, which comes from aerospace and engineering, that you need to be able to adapt to different environmental changes. And he says what we need is to have different relationships with different partners for different reasons, rather than just saying, these are our allies and these are our adversaries. And he's very explicit about partnership with China in that, and extremely explicit about rethinking the Canadian-American alliance. So middle powers and smaller nations, when working together, can achieve so much more than those competing greater powers can on their own. And I would say this is the geopolitical moment to really be leveraging that. But to say a little bit more about this policy lever. So as Tristan told us, we've heard Australian policymakers say space technology is a medium. So we're not going to lean into investing to doing it all our own, but it is a medium by which to achieve other policy ends, primarily security and diplomacy related. Was that a Menzies quote? I've taken it from your paper and I didn't say who wrote it to.
You certainly had that intent.
Yeah. So we're not going to do it all ourselves, but these space technology partnerships that we have these other political ends. So when we have collective investments in resilience, and that can be a defence-related term, it can be a climate and bushfire-related term. When we have collective investments in that, those investments are cheaper, they're stronger, they're more resilient because they're not geographically limited, and they're stronger than a kind of separate individual fortress approach. The entire region benefits from those technology needs that we need to serve. Our geography is much more similar. Our needs are much more similar. As a byproduct, we then have a region that is much more shored up. So civil space technology, partnerships and collaboration, actually leading to greater regional security. And there's a couple of examples. We have some of the team here from ANU Institute for Space, and the Quantum Optical Ground Station up on Mount Stromlo got to have a really exciting test with the Artemis flight, laser communications. And it's the 21st century version of what we did with the dish under the Apollo landings back in 1969, the high definition, much more secure version of that. if we were to have ground stations like that networked across the region, so again, we don't have to build the satellites, we don't have to do the space segment, but if we built a shared network of optical and quantum-ready ground stations in countries across the region, we have a highly secure sovereign or shared sovereign infrastructure for our communications needs. That's the way that we need to be thinking. Similarly, for Aquawatch, and Cassandra is going to talk us much more through an Earth observation for water quality for the region and by the region. So Space Technology Partnership is also about generating equality and equity, closing that digital divide, uplifting other countries in the nation. And by the way, Australia is not the white saviour in this. We are the ones who are going to benefit from those who are already leading in the region, but we have pieces to contribute into that infrastructure. So I'm not advocating for a neo-colonial Australia in the Asian century or Australia locating itself in the region. I'm saying it's not about Australia in the Asia Pacific, but many, many countries are way out ahead of us, and we can witness that at the APRSAF every year, where Indonesia, Singapore, the Philippines, Malaysia, and of course Japan, South Korea, they are way out ahead of Australia. So we have a lot to learn, but we also have critical pieces to contribute. And that's precisely the role that the Australasian Centre for Space Governance hopes to facilitate. Thank you.
The Australasian Centre for Space Governance is a not-for-profit association. We are a transdisciplinary hub, bridging expertise in space law, policy, history, political and social sciences to advocate and shape perspectives on responsible space governance, ensuring that space supports well-being, prosperity and sustainability for current and future generations across the Asia Pacific. The Space Matters podcast is supported by research funds of the Australasian Centre for Space Governance and is produced by Daniel McKay. You can find out more about today's guest in our show notes, and you can follow us on LinkedIn, Blue Sky, and Instagram. Watch this podcast video on YouTube or listen on your favourite podcasting platform.